So the first session, we will have two speakers, David Senf, National Security Strategist from Bell, and Allan McDonald, Systems Engineer from Palo Alto Networks. And very quick, I will quickly introduce those two speakers. David is responsible for analyzing technology trends at Bell to help define Bell's service roadmap, M&A opportunities, and also help large business customers to meet their complex security objectives. Prior to Bell, David is well known in the industry. He was a vice president of security research at IDC. And Allan has over 20 years of experience in network and security architecture. He has worked with organizations in many verticals, such as finance, utilities, public safety, manufacturing, and healthcare, and to build highly available and highly segmented networks. And he helped organizations build out architectures that allow them to implement tools like IPS, XDR, and DDoS protection. And they too will join together to do a presentation regarding the successes and failures of Canadian organizations' cloud security.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. And thanks, Brian, for the invitation. And by the way, thanks as well, Brian, for all you do to bring the security community together. I think it's very important that, we all work together, that we support each other, because no one can understand all of what goes on in cybersecurity. We've got application security, network security, identity and access management, and on it goes. And of course, we've got cloud security, just the surface of which we'll be covering off today. It's one of those classic icebergs where we'll give you a little bit of the top of the iceberg, but of course, there's a lot underneath as well. So again, thank you for that, Brian. And Allan, it's exciting to be working with you on this session. I know we're going to have a fun time. Allan is a business artist. That's what I'm going to call you. I'm not sure if you do. Do you do art on the side as well? Because you're great at annotating.
I don't do anything on the side, but I'm going to put that on my my business card now.
Business artist.
Business artist. I love it.
You'll all see what I mean in just a minute as we get into this. And we've got a lot to get through in a very short period of time. The good news is that we don't disappear. We're part of the community. We're always happy to answer your questions during the session, after the session. What I would suggest you do is, as we're going through, push the questions into the chat. Brian is going to be triaging those for us. We'll also get those all set up for the panel session as well. And then afterwards, you can always feel free to reach out to us as well. We'll be more than happy to dialogue with you further. So certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn or otherwise, and I'd be very happy to connect with you. So with that, Allan, why don't we get right into things?
Let's rock.
Okay, let's get into it. So what do you think of this relatively controversial quote, at least this controversial quote when it came out? It was a couple of years ago when Anton Javakin, who's a former Gartner analyst, and then he went over to Google. And so now he's on the Google Cloud Security team. They do actually a really good podcast over there that I'd highly recommend. But this quote was interesting because he's saying, look, things are very different in the cloud than they are on-prem. And Allan, I'd argue that the controls themselves, okay, maybe they change a little bit. It's more maybe the priority order that I put on them, the emphasis that I put on certain controls versus other controls in the cloud, as I try and secure data to and from the cloud, as I try and secure data in the cloud, and then as I try and secure that thin veil of features and configurations between, my secure data on the one hand and the public internet on the other, which is of the cloud. And don't worry, we'll get into that and make it all make sense in just a minute. But what was your take when you first saw this quote?
Yeah, I mean, I think he hits the nail on the head, and I think it's important because it's important that it is shocking, right? Because we do want to send that message that we're doing something fundamentally different, right? And probably in the early days of cloud, when people are trying to figure it out, right? As you're dipping your toes in, it can feel like conventional networking, conventional security, and that's where you can start going down the wrong path. Right, is you need to accept that and internalize that and start thinking about controls in a different way, right? A lot of the best practices and sort of the higher level conceptual stuff might still be the same or similar or linked, right? But in terms of how you implement it, how you operationalize it, right? We're talking, it's a different ball game for sure.
Yeah, I agree. So we are definitely off to a good start here when we think about like so on the one hand, I'm thinking about traffic going to and from the cloud, and that's like, would you agree? It's kind of that's the SASE side of things, secure access service edge, where I'm looking at secure web gateway, CASB, all ZTNA, those kinds of things that allow me to secure the traffic going to my mobile devices, going from the cloud to my data center, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of that side of it. And then the other side, which is probably more we're going to touch on today, and then Drew is going to do a great job in coming up after us and talking a little bit more about cloud native application protection platform. What happened was Gartner ran out of 4-letter acronyms, so they've gone to 5-letter acronyms with CNAP now. Anyway, so we'll get into what that's all about in just a couple minutes. But that's really that in the cloud and the of the cloud components of it.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I like looking at it this way, right? Obviously SASE and SSE are a very different combination of technologies that as compared to CNAP, right? Or and some of the related technologies like CSPM, CWPP, right? Even more acronyms to fire out. But I think it's important to when you start thinking of the transformation, right? To think about it end to end, right? Is these are your pillars, your cornerstones of how you're going to architecturally approach security or how you're going to transform security as the company or the enterprise, the organization goes towards digital transformation, right? So I think these are really helpful building blocks to have in your mind, right? As the enterprise shifts.
That's excellent. And what we're going to get into is why and how are some organizations more successful as they go down the path of the cloud, as they go deeper into the cloud, and why are some less successful from a security perspective, and give that contrast of what makes that difference. And we studied over 300 organizations to find out why. Like, why are some seeing much better security outcomes than others? And we'll get into that in just a minute. So with that, I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. Or I won't. As these things go, as you do things live, of course, everything changes. And I'm going to do this now. Okay, so what we're looking at in Canada is this decided shift from on-prem into the cloud. We were very reticent to move into the cloud in Canada. And then we see this hockey stick of growth in this 5-year period from 2021 to 2026, this doubling of the activity that's happening from a cloud perspective. So that's amazing. What we're also seeing is this shift towards more platform as a service. So whereas before we had, a lot of software as a service, infrastructure as a service, so lift and shift and straight up replacing of the application, now we're seeing this going deeper into digital transformation. And what does that really mean? It's like, a financial services firm being able to change the features of its mobile application more quickly, or, a retailer being able to maybe establish greater visibility into its supply chain by spinning up new applications that others can get access to more quickly, and that sort of thing. There's a range of different types of applications that can be spun up within a platform as a service environment, but it really shows how we're maturing as a nation. I think it's really important. So really grateful and just glad to see that we're moving in that direction overall. So yeah, so Allan, when you look at this, were you surprised to finally see that migration and that kind of momentum?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like I talk to a lot of organizations out there that are in various points in their digital transformation, right? And it seems like in some industry verticals, and I guess it depends on how customer facing you are, right? Because digital transformation a lot of the time, it's about being customer centric, right? User centric design, having rolling out features really quickly based on what the customers want, right? But what I found interesting in the early days, right, is I would ask a lot of customers, are you in the cloud? And I'd get a lot of no's, even just a few years ago. And this bucket here existed even then, right? But in those days, it was almost like customers didn't view SaaS as the cloud, right? And a lot of times it was probably because maybe they got pushed there a little bit, just because that's where their software vendors were going, right? If you had a voice solution or a wireless LAN controller or email that was hosted on-prem, it's probably in a SaaS solution now. And what I find interesting is now that we see especially the PaaS stuff growing, right? This is really the enterprise is doing this because they're looking to have that transformation, right? Whether it starts at a digital transformation, and then that kind of falls down to things like user-centric design, which goes down to DevOps, and then we find ourselves pretty quickly at PaaS. But I actually think there's a mirror between them, because a lot of the reasons that these SaaS applications went this way in the first place was so that those vendors could implement probably PaaS and those types of service-oriented designs under the hood. And now sort of the rest of the enterprises are going in that direction because it's a proven methodology, right? And I think when we're talking about security, it's really important to realize why that's important. Why when an organization is looking to transform, right, there's this sort of column where you can get right down to sort of that distributed microservices architecture at the sort of the architecture layer, right? But it's really being driven at the top by that user-centric design that's such a core fundamental part of digital transformation. So it's a real strategic priority in most cases now.
Yeah, really well said, and thank you for that great setup. Look at this. As organizations are shifting into the cloud, you can see this decided, momentum towards cloud-based security, where 70 cents on every dollar spent in security is moving towards the cloud by 2026, according to research firm IDC. You can see that in the green bars relative to those little stout blue bars that you see, which are the on-prem traditional security relative to what's happening there. So that's a big shift that we're seeing in the marketplace. But let's take this a little bit of a step further, and let's get into the actual study that we conducted and see the different types of organizations. And you can start to think about, what type of organization am I? And I know that there's some students on the line as well, so you can start to think of, what kind of company would I like to work for? And what kind of security do I want to help companies adopt? And how do I want to help them transition from where they are to where they need to get? And we'll also talk, Allan, you hand waved at DevOps, and certainly that's an area where we saw some real interesting patterns arising from organizations. So very quickly, what we did was we looked at quite a number of different kinds of exposures in the cloud, everything from infrastructure as code template misconfigurations to not knowing the complete inventory of APIs to exposed credentials and what have you. So a range of different exposures relative to what are the countermeasures the organization has in place, and then right in the middle looked at what are the security outcomes that actually happened, mean time to respond, how many breaches happened, size of breach, and those kinds of things, and you can start to bring that together. So what we started to do was to look at where the organizations were at based on where they are in the cloud. Are you early in the cloud, right? Or are you deeper into the cloud? And then looking at it from security effectiveness, are you less effective overall from a security perspective or more effective? So it gives us a classic 4-quadrant. And of course, Allan, with every 4 quadrants, I want to be in the upper right, of course. But
the coveted position.
But yeah, exactly. Of course it is. So I want to ask the question, like, what the heck went wrong here? Why is security so poor in these organizations that went out to the cloud? And what about these organizations over here where they didn't bother and yet things still aren't going very well? And then ultimately, how do we wind up getting up here? So yeah, I think I'm excited to see what happens. And I think you are too. So do you want to just jump right into it?
Yeah, absolutely, right. I think the question here, right, is when you look at the quadrant, like just like all the vendor quadrants, right, what's important here is movement, right? How do you get from one quadrant to the other? What qualities does your organization have to have? What technology, really the people, process, and technology, it often comes down to that, right? So a lot of the time, what went wrong here? Um, the a couple different things, right? I think there's probably a denialist factor to some degree, right? There is the feeling that maybe there's not going to be the investment or the support to move this way, or ideally this way, to move data into the cloud, right? So here I think a lot of the time, especially in terms of security, one of the biggest characteristics you see here is you're viewing the cloud as an opportunity for security, right?
Agree.
A lot of new threats come with the cloud, but a lot of new capabilities as well, right? A lot of potentially more visibility. And I think when you see here, this is an interesting journey as well. Sometimes that's the what I've heard is, if we have one more breach, everything goes to the cloud, right? And there's a little bit of a denial factor there too, where it's I'm just going to assume the cloud is secure, right? I don't have any work to do, right? Which is also a problem, right? So these are the lines we don't want to be on, and here, right, it's sort of a optimistic realism, I think, is the combination to have that nice diagonal line.
I really like it. I love the setup here. I think this is absolutely brilliant. So let's look at what the actual results said, which is very similar to what you're saying here, which I again want to get into some of the details on this, which is first we've got our organizations. Remember, they went into the cloud. Security outcomes for them wasn't quite as good. You know what's surprising though? And so, Allan, I like the fact that you talked about people, process, and technology, because these organizations, they actually have among the largest security budgets of organizations in Canada.
Yep.
They do go down the road of DevSecOps. So we definitely want to pull on that thread a little bit more and find out, like, wait, you shift left, you're
Yep.
pushing security controls into the code build and deploy phase, and yet things aren't going well. Well, wait, but we're telling you to do that, and yet things are falling down. So we'll unpack that in just a minute. They as well spend on technology. And I run to these customers, so I'll talk to the customer and they'll be bragging about some of the latest, gear that they've bought and that sort of thing. And you'll talk to them, okay, well, but what about the skills of your people? What processes do you have in place? They'll scratch their head a little bit and they'll give you some kind of vague answer. And that's our denialists. These are organizations where they haven't had the opportunity because of sometimes they don't have enough resources, but they haven't skilled up their people in the way that maybe they should be. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about specifically things that are going wrong by talking about some of the things that are going right when we talk about organizations and that leadership quadrant that we'll get into. And just like you're calling them kind of traditionalists, or we can call them, defeatists or what have you, these are organizations where they haven't gone into the cloud. For these organizations, it's difficult to get resources and budget. They typically have a lot of technical debt, and it's difficult for them to move off of that technical debt, right? And for them, it's also difficult for them to secure those environments just based on the lack of resources they have. These organizations start to get more interesting where security is being performed at a higher level. These typically are in some of the financial services firms in Canada, as an example. So they're not as deeply entrenched in the cloud, but they've got some pretty rigorous processes in place. They do train their people a lot. They've got a lot of training in place. That really makes a difference. particularly when you're thinking about things like incident response. You want to be well practiced. That's going to make a big difference in terms of some of the activity that's going on. And then, of course, we get into the coveted upper right-hand quadrant, and that's our strategist. And our strategist, there's certain areas where they're focused on. And for the study, we decided to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. Now, you could use the CSA CCM, the cloud capability model, or you could use CIS 18 controls, and those have mappings as well into NIST CSF. So that's great. We can use those kind of Rosetta Stones, if you will, to make those translations. But what I want to highlight, and what Allan and I will take you through, is what are the areas that the strategist focused on that made a difference, right? If you dial up certain areas, what gets you ahead of your peers in Canada? Let's take a look. So, Allan, we want to identify, get the inventory of our assets, right? We want to protect them in some way, right? With identity solutions, application security, that kind of thing. I want to detect when something's happening, so I got to log and monitor. I have to respond when attacks. I have to contain and eradicate as quickly as I can. And then, of course, I need to recover to known good business. That winds up being a bit of a tricky area for some organizations. So let's see, should ask the audience to vote on which of these two functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework led to organizations performing much better than their peers. And then under each one, we then looked at the sub-processes. So it wasn't just the top 5 functions, but it was then the processes and technologies underneath. But I won't keep you in suspense any longer because Brian Lee is thinking, well, you guys are running out of time. So let me just show you here. The number 1 area was, identify. Right? So organizations who are able to understand what is the inventory of the assets that I have. Now, that could be something like Cloud Access Security Broker as a very kind of early starting point, but we want to understand even more broadly what our attack surfaces across our supply chain, our dependencies of our different applications in ways that you're not going to get from a traditional kind of CASB type of approach, right? So, configuration management was the other area that really made a difference under identify. Right now, inventory, I'm passing by it really quickly to say, just go do inventory. It's not that easy, and that's why organizations who do it and do it well are separated from their peers. But ask questions later on, and we'll be happy to dive into that more deeply. But configuration management really stood out as an area of differentiation. And Allan, you're probably familiar with that quote from Gartner that says 99% of breaches in the cloud will be a result of misconfigurations and human error. And so that definitely stood out when we thought about that area. Anything else that stood out on the identify front for you, or do you want me to jump to the next area?
Well, I think, it's sort of maybe not the flashier of the 5 things, right? We spend a lot of time, and some of the other ones, talking to vendors about, machine learning and all that stuff. But it really is, it's the fundamentals, it's the foundations of a good security program is knowing what you have so you can secure it, right?
And to respond. So if I'm trying to eradicate an attacker from my environment and I don't know all the assets I have, it can be kind of difficult. And this repeat infection that you get from the same threat actor is very common. Absolutely. All right, so number 2 on the list, we jump over protect. We don't land as far as we could into respond. We actually get into detect. So our strategist got into that upper right-hand quadrant by dialing up focus on identify, in particular inventory and configuration management, and then they slide over to detect, and they're logging and monitoring their cloud-based environment, right? Now, that's easier said than done as well. And Allan, maybe you want to take us through just a little bit on some of the challenges there, or just any quick thoughts in terms of how to prioritize, because there's a lot of different logs. But the good news about the cloud, I think, is that you get more logging capability than you had on-prem. And so I think that's a really exciting, but sometimes it can be overwhelming for organizations. So
yeah,
quick thoughts there.
100%, right? Like a lot of the time in the past, it was getting the right telemetry in, right? It was so hard with syslog and sort of those older technologies. The cloud has so much telemetry. Now it's about using intelligence and leveraging automation and AI to bubble the right stuff up to the top, right? So much, after sort of the initial steps in cloud, right, it is going to be sort of living off the land, abuse of credentials, malicious or otherwise non-malicious protocols and stuff like that. So it's really is exactly what you have here, right? What has changed, as opposed to what's something that I know that's bad, because that's the older way of doing it for sure.
Yeah, it's like learn normal, detect bad, and
Yep.
and really have a good sense of where that is. And the good thing about the cloud is it gives us more capability. So what separated our strategists from those pragmatists, both of whom were doing fairly well, but our strategists did the best from a security perspective, which you couldn't really see from that chart. They look even, is that they're taking advantage of the cloud, the ability to log in ways that they weren't able to do on-prem, and to integrate and to automate some of the capabilities that otherwise they weren't able to do on-prem. So that really made a difference. I'm going to move a little bit quickly as we start to close off and move into Drew's presentation in not too long. And so I do want to pull on that thread quickly, though. We mentioned that organizations shift left, and yet these poor denialists, where things weren't going well for them, what happens? So they shift left. Their developers are starting to say, okay, well, I'm going to integrate some of these processes into what I'm doing. A couple of things happen, some of which would take a lot longer than we have here to unpack. But what the denialists do is they shift left, and so they're doing static analysis, dynamic analysis, looking for credentials in their code and things like that. That's great, and they're making sure that they're secure in coding and in building but sometimes they're taking some of their old processes and trying to force fit them into their CI/CD processes, which isn't working out for them so well. What really is happening is additionally is that the strategists, what they do is, yes, they shift left, not quite as much as often because their cloud native applications aren't quite as numerous as the denials are, but what they are doing is getting a complete view from operations, so shield right. So once the application is production, and shift left. So the security team has good visibility across the environment, as opposed to it's the developer with a bunch of individual tools looking into their environment and kind of doing what they think is best from a security perspective, versus the strategist, where it's the security team is much more involved throughout the process, both left of production, but also in production as well, right? So big differences there. Quick comments on that as well, Allan?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously mandate is a huge thing here, right? The security team, right? That's their goal in life is end to end application lifecycle security, right? And it is for the DevOps team as well. But they have other goals, right? They have to get code out. They have to get applications deployed. So when you can kind of see them come together, right, and they get into things like platform engineering and stuff like that, is sometimes how it can come together nicely, where the security team is responsible for deploying that sort of end-to-end sort of environment that the developers can live and work and breathe in, right? But one way or the other, that's the key, right? Is having that end-to-end visibility.
It really makes a big difference. And so what you want to think about as we start to close off is you want to think about your progression from traditional software as a service, or potentially lift and shift. You want to think about what controls you have in place and what solutions, and more importantly, what processes you'll have in place put around that to secure your environment. As you move towards cloud native, the order of operations, the emphasis that you put on certain controls will shift. As you go deeper into cloud native, it'll further shift, and the emphasis that you'll need to put on those security controls and the skills that you'll need will continue to migrate towards some of the things that we've been talking about here. There's much more we'll unpack during the panel session as well, but I've listed out, both Allan and I, some of the areas you want to think about as you mature across this path. This is a very short version. You can also look at CSA CCM, the cloud capability model, and there's a lot of good stuff in there as well that can help you in looking at the processes that you want to evolve over time. But Allan, I wanted to close off on this just to give folks some practical, because I know we go out and we do assessments, and we also do like a managed cloud service. We work with you guys a lot, and wanted to just give folk a flavor for some of the things that that they should be looking for in terms of these solutions. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I think we're seeing here is sort of situational awareness in this slide, right? When we're talking about again, it goes back to mandate, right? The security team, responsible both for telemetry, but also preventing misconfigurations, right? So we want to be able to see as much as we can in one spot, right? So if you look here, right, we know we have 970 resources. We know that they're spread across multiple cloud environments. Again, right, that's huge for most organizations that are going to implement multi-cloud. We have what we call compliance trends, right? So we're able to at a glance see how we're doing against our various compliance frameworks that we have to meet, right? It could be any of the cloud security frameworks, ISO, or something specific to your industry to which you have to comply, and then dive deeper here, right? Into each pass, right? Like what resources are passing and failing for each one. Right, so these are different, like NIST CSF is up here, high trust is here, and then a breakdown with the ability to drive in. Right, it goes back to that 99% are misconfigurations. That's the real problem, or sort of the first problem we need to dive into with as you start to build out out a platform like this, is getting that visibility, right? The what, the who, the first thing, the first column in the CSF from the results from the study.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a number of great points. It's really about being able to see across a multi-cloud environment. It's having that visibility into what I have. It's knowing that I'm still compliant, that I can tell the auditors, yes, we're still compliant, even though we've moved into this cloud-based environment, and we can tell our business leaders, et cetera, yes, we're still good. But also that we can prioritize, that we can set the priority on what matters most, what matters least. And oftentimes with our developers, we find it difficult to give them that priority order. So this kind of helps if that's what you're doing. Some of you in the audience are thinking, well, we don't do a lot of application development. That's absolutely fine. This still applies if you're using, lift and shift into an IaaS environment or into a PaaS environment, and some of the controls that you'll be putting in place there as well to really be able to prioritize, because we all have limited resources and we need to know where to go. We need to know what to put emphasis on. And that just really makes a difference for organizations as well. So, and that again is really what our strategists are able to do. There's a lot more in behind the study. I neglected to drop the link in here, but I'm gonna have to do that with Brian. Maybe we can set up something, send out something later on with that. But it'll go to the larger study that goes in more depth for you to unpack that. But if you have questions as we go, how you become a strategist and what were some of the other challenges that we saw with organizations, because like I said off the top, Allan and I were really just going to scratch the surface of what's happening.